The window in room 118 at Meadow Pines Care Center looked out over a parking lot. Eleanor Harmon had memorized every car that belonged to a staff member and could tell you, without being told, when the morning shift was running 10 minutes behind simply by watching which vehicles were still missing at 7:10. She was 78 years old, and her mind worked the same way it always had, carefully, specifically, and without sentiment for anything that did not deserve it. What she had learned in 2 years of sitting in this room was that a parking lot could be a clock if you paid attention to it, and that paying attention was the only freedom left to a person whose days had been arranged entirely by other people without anyone asking. The room was clean. The staff were not unkind. That had been the first thing she understood when they brought her here, and understanding it had not made the room feel larger or the days feel shorter. It had simply meant there was no one to be angry at, which was in some ways worse than having someone to be angry at. She had read that thought in a novel once, and had considered it academic at the time. It was less academic now. Her name was on a laminated card beside the door, Eleanor Harmon, room 118. Below that, in the same institutional font, Cognitive Support Program. She had asked the head nurse, a woman named Margaret, to remove that second line on 4 separate occasions over the past 2 years. Each time, Margaret had smiled in the way of a person trained to receive requests without processing them, and the card had remained exactly as it was. Eleanor had stopped asking. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She did the crossword every morning before breakfast, in pen, because she had always done it in pen and she saw no reason to stop now. She had identified a medication dispensing error in her 3rd week at Meadow Pines, a dosage discrepancy between the written order and what the night aide was actually preparing, and had written a letter to the facility administrator about it that had resulted in a corrected protocol, though no one had said thank you, and the administrator had not met her eyes in the hallway for 6 weeks afterward. She had written 2 letters to her attorney, a man named Howard Pell, who had worked with her and Harold for many years, and received no response. She had learned from a staff member who liked her, a nurse named Rosa, that correspondence from residents was handled through the facility mail system, which meant it passed through the front desk before leaving the building. She had not known this when she wrote the letters. She had thought about it every day since. Eleanor Harmon had been, before room 118 and before the parking lot clock and before the laminated card beside her door, a schoolteacher, and then a wife, and then a widow, and then a woman managing her own affairs in a 4-bedroom colonial on Persimmon Lane, with a bay window that caught the morning light at an angle she still thought about sometimes when the light in this room turned a certain way in the afternoon. She had taught 7th grade English for 11 years before she met Harold, at a school in a neighborhood that did not have much money, and she had been good at it in the specific way that meant she understood, instinctively, and without needing it explained to her, that what children needed from a teacher was not instruction but attention. She had known which children were hungry, and which were sleeping somewhere they should not have been sleeping, and which ones came in wearing the face of a person carrying weight that no child should be asked to carry. She had done something about it when she could. She had not talked about it. It was not the kind of thing she talked about. It was the kind of thing she did because it was in front of her, and she had the capacity to do it. And she had never understood the people who treated those 2 conditions as insufficient reason. Harold had come into her life when she was 33. He was 40, already successful in commercial real estate, and he had the kind of confidence that reads either as arrogance or as earned ability, depending on the day. She had loved him more carefully than she had expected to love anyone. The marriage had been good more years than it had been difficult, and she had given up teaching for the house and the children and the life Harold wanted, which she had done voluntarily and without being pressured, though she had sometimes, working in the garden, thought about the classroom and the children and who she had been in it. She and Harold had 2 children together, Gerald, who was 54 now and had Harold's confidence and considerably less of Harold's judgment, and Diane, who was 51 and sharper and more careful, and who had learned young that the world gave advantages to people who appeared to be whatever other people needed them to appear to be. Eleanor had loved both of her children with the full and uncomplicated love of a mother, and had seen them clearly at the same time, which was, she had come to understand, a harder combination than most people realized. She had also had Patricia. Patricia was from before Harold, From the early marriage to Daniel Webb that had lasted 3 years and ended when Eleanor was 26 and Patricia was 2. Daniel had been a man of real warmth and very limited practical ability, and the marriage had ended not with cruelty, but with the slow recognition that warmth and intention were not enough to hold two people together when the world asked practical ability from everyone involved. He had left them both without meanness and without staying, and he had died in his mid-50s of a heart attack that better insurance might have caught. Patricia grew up in Eleanor and Harold's house as a full member of the family, formally. Harold had never been cruel to her. He had provided for her and been polite to her and maintained a careful distance that Patricia felt every day of her childhood without it ever being explained to her directly. Gerald and Diane had not been openly unkind to Patricia. Children who sense the adult in the room will not intervene are rarely overtly anything. They had been the kind of unkind that leaves no marks: exclusion, coordination, the subtle management of being elsewhere whenever Patricia was somewhere. Eleanor had tried to address it and had tried gently and had tried by rearranging occasions and schedules, and none of it had been enough because the thing she was trying to correct was not a behavior in the children. It was a permission they sensed coming from a level above them, and she had never found the right way to revoke it from the source. Patricia had left at 18 and not come back much. She had married a man she loved, had a son, and worked as a home health aide for most of her adult life, caring for elderly people in their homes, which Eleanor had come to think of as Patricia becoming the thing Eleanor herself had once been in a classroom: the person who actually looked at you. Patricia died 8 years ago. Ovarian cancer, found late. It moved quickly. Eleanor had wanted to go to the funeral. Gerald and Diane had discouraged it, gently, with reasonable-sounding reasons. The distance, Eleanor's health at the time, the awkwardness of a reunion shaped by grief. She had not gone. She had sat at Persimmon Lane alone and mourned her daughter alone, and the mourning had settled in the particular way that grief settles when it never gets the ceremony it deserves. It had not gone anywhere. It had simply changed form and taken up permanent residence. Patricia had left behind a son, Marcus Webb. Eleanor had seen a photograph once, sent by Patricia in a letter that Gerald had found and returned to its envelope and placed on Eleanor's nightstand without comment, which was its own kind of cruelty, delivering the thing and the distance in the same gesture. The photograph was of a boy, maybe 12, standing in front of a school building with a backpack on and Patricia's eyes. Patricia's way of looking at the camera, too slightly sideways, as though he wasn't entirely sure the camera deserved his full attention. Eleanor had kept that photograph inside a worn copy of a Dickens novel she had taught every year in 7th grade. The book had come with her to Meadow Pines, packed by Gerald into a cardboard box without consultation. The photograph was still between pages 112 and 113. She knew this because she had checked twice in the first week she was here, when the box was unpacked and she was taking inventory of what had and had not arrived, cataloging what she still had. She thought about Marcus Webb sometimes in the evenings when the light in the parking lot changed from gray to amber and the sounds of the facility settled into their nighttime register. She thought about him without bitterness, with something quieter, the specific sorrow of a door you should have left open and that you can no longer reach from where you are now. She had no way to reach him. She had no way to reach anyone she hadn't seen in 2 years, which was the entire point. This she had come to understand with the cold clarity of a person whose mind was working exactly as it always had, surrounded by a structure that had every investment in the story remaining as written. Marcus Webb had passed the bar on his second attempt, and he did not apologize for it, and would not have apologized for it even if someone had asked, because the first attempt had come 4 months after his mother died, and he had sat in that exam room and been unable to locate the part of himself that was supposed to care about the distinction between an easement appurtenant and an easement in gross. The second time, he passed by 31 points. He had been employed at Caldwell and Raines, a 3-attorney firm in Hayden, Ohio, for 4 years as of that March. The firm did elder law. It was not where Marcus had imagined landing when he started law school. He had gone in thinking about civil rights work, about public defense, something with a clear adversary and a cause he could name. What he had found in a clinical rotation his second year was elder financial abuse cases, and in those cases he had found something that felt like the particular anger of a person who recognizes what they are looking at before they have been told what it is. He had watched it happen to the people his mother cared for. He had seen its outline in 3 households she worked in during his high school years: the adult children who materialized near the end, the paperwork that appeared, the accounts that drained, the parent who had spent 40 years building a life and who ended in a room that did not look like what 40 years was supposed to produce. His mother, Patricia Webb, had not talked about it directly. She had come home from those shifts with a tightness in her face that he had learned to recognize and had not pushed on, because he understood, at 15 and 16 and 17, that there were things she carried in a specific way and that pushing on them was not what she needed. Once, when he was 16, he had asked about her current client, an old habit she indulged, and she had looked at him and said, "A woman named Helen who raised 3 kids and built a good life and is now watching one of her sons decide he's earned the right to it." She paused. "He hasn't earned it." She said nothing more. But Marcus had filed it, the way his mother filed things, without knowing exactly when he would need it again. He had filed a great deal from his mother. She was not a person who talked at length about herself or about the family she had come from. The one that had made it quietly clear it did not fully include her. She mentioned her mother, Eleanor, exactly 3 times in Marcus's memory. Each time was brief. Each time she touched it the way you touch something that is still warm and then put it down. Her name is Eleanor. She's not a bad person. She's a person who made a wrong choice, and there is a difference. She had said that in their kitchen on Garfield Street when Marcus was about 14, while making dinner, while he was pretending to do homework at the table. He had not asked follow-up questions. He had understood they were not being invited. Patricia Webb died of ovarian cancer when Marcus was 24. She was 50 years old. She died in the spring, in the apartment on Garfield Street that they had shared since Marcus was 7, in the room that had always been her room, with Marcus sitting in the chair beside the bed the way she had always said she wanted it, though she had said it long before it was imminent, and in the abstract way of someone who expects the abstract to remain abstract for a long time. It did not remain abstract. It arrived in February and was over by April, and Marcus had sat in that chair and held his mother's hand and watched her go with the specific helplessness of a person who has done everything available to them and still cannot stop the thing that is coming. After she was gone, he had tried once to find Eleanor. He was 24 and new to grief and looking for threads the way grieving people look for threads. He found a phone number listed for Harmon in Columbus in an old directory. The number was disconnected. He wrote a letter to the address on file and received nothing back. He decided that some doors were closed for reasons that had existed long before he arrived at them, and that he needed to finish law school. He finished. He passed the bar the second time. He came to Caldwell and Raines and became, over 4 years, the person the firm called when a case required someone willing to sit in a facility conference room with a frightened elderly person for 3 hours and ask careful questions and actually listen to the answers. He was good at it in the specific way his mother had been good at her work, not because he performed care, but because the attention was genuine. He noticed things. He remembered what people told him without taking notes. And he took notes anyway because he had been a careful person his whole life and saw no reason to stop. The call about Eleanor Harmon came on a Wednesday morning in early March. He took it because the partner who usually handled intake was in court. The woman on the line identified herself as Rosa Mendez, a licensed practical nurse at Meadow Pines Care Center in Garfield Township, 45 minutes from Hayden. She said she was calling about a resident and that she understood this was not the standard way to report concerns, but that the standard way had not produced a response, and she was not comfortable stopping there. Marcus pulled a legal pad in front of him and listened. Rosa spoke without rushing and without dramatizing. She had been a nurse for 22 years, she said. She was not someone who made calls like this without being certain she had reason to. The resident in question was a 78-year-old woman admitted 22 months ago under a cognitive support designation, which at Meadow Pines meant a higher level of supervised care. The woman was not, in Rosa's daily professional assessment, cognitively impaired. She solved the crossword every morning before breakfast, in pen. She had, in her 3rd week at the facility, identified a medication dispensing error and written a letter to the administrator about it that was more clearly organized than anything Rosa had seen come out of the administrative office in 3 years. The resident's family had not visited in 11 months and did not respond to facility communications with any consistency. Rosa had looked at the admissions paperwork closely enough to find the name of the physician who performed the original assessment. She had looked up that physician's license. It had been suspended 16 months ago. Marcus asked 3 follow-up questions. Rosa answered them all without hesitation. He told her he would call back by end of week after reviewing whatever documentation she was willing to send, and she told him she had already put a packet together because she had expected whoever called back to ask for it. He read Rosa's packet twice before Thursday. The assessment document used language he recognized from 3 previous cases, the specific construction of clinical-sounding language designed to be technically defensible while supporting whatever conclusion someone wanted to draw from it. The admitting physician's name was Dr. Philip Oates. The suspension on his license, Rosa had included a copy, was for falsifying assessment documentation in an unrelated matter in a different county. The timeline of Oates' work for Meadow Pines and its referring parties overlapped with the suspension investigation by 14 months. Marcus put the packet down on his desk and sat with it for a moment. He had been in this exact position before, looking at a document that told him clearly what had happened while knowing that clearly was not the same as provably, and that the distance between those two things was where most of this work actually lived. He called Rosa back on Friday and told her he intended to drive out on Thursday of the following week if Mrs. Harmon agreed to meet with him. Rosa said she would speak with Mrs. Harmon personally, not through the facility's communication system. She would find a quiet moment. Does she know someone has filed a concern? Marcus asked. She knows I've been trying to help her find a way to reach someone, Rosa said. She's been very careful about not appearing to be aware that she's being managed. She is aware. She has been aware for a long time. The drive from Hayden to Meadow Pines took 51 minutes on a gray Thursday morning with light traffic and low clouds that had been threatening rain since Tuesday, without committing to it. He drove with the documents in a folder on the passenger seat, though he had read them enough times that he did not need them. He drove thinking about what Rosa had said, the crossword in pen, the medication letter, and what those details told him before he had spoken to Eleanor Harmon once. They told him the story he had seen the outline of 3 times before. A person whose mind still worked exactly as it always had, placed inside a structure built for a person whose mind no longer did, with every incentive in the institutional arrangement pointing toward the story staying exactly as written. He also thought about the family name, Harmon. It had not landed on him when Rosa first said it. It had not landed on him during the week of reading the file. It landed somewhere in the 45-minute drive, briefly, and then passed, the way a half-formed thought passes when you have something more pressing in front of you. His mother had never used her stepfather's name. She had kept her father's name, Webb, and had given it to Marcus. The Harmon name was not a name he had any particular reason to connect to anyone specific. He set it aside and focused on the road. He pulled into the Meadow Pines parking lot at 9:47. He found a visitor space, sat in the car for a moment before going in, a habit he had developed before difficult first meetings, a 30-second pause to establish what he intended to do in the room before the room started directing him. His intention was to listen. It was always the intention. He went inside. The facility was clean and lit in the particular way of institutional spaces designed by someone who understood that warmth and the appearance of warmth were different things, but who had worked with what was available, the right paint colors, the right lighting temperature, the potted plants near the reception desk. He signed in, was given a visitor badge, and was sitting in the small waiting area when Rosa Mendez appeared from a side corridor. She was in her 40s, dark hair pulled back, moving with the specific, unhurried efficiency of a nurse who had learned to cover ground without appearing to rush. She shook his hand without ceremony. "She knows you're coming," Rosa said. "I told her last week, when I had a moment alone with her." She paused. "I want to ask you something before you go in. She has the right to refuse this meeting." "Completely," Marcus said. Rosa nodded. "She won't refuse. But I wanted her to know it was an option, and I want you to know I told her." She looked at him steadily. The last family member to visit was 11 months ago. Her son. He stayed 20 minutes. He was on his phone for most of it. She paused. "She's been waiting for someone to come in who had a different reason." He thanked her. She went back to her station, and a few minutes later a young aide led Marcus down the hall to the conference room, a small space with a round table and 4 chairs, a window looking out at a strip of bare trees, the kind of room reserved for care plan meetings and family conversations that were not going well. The aide introduced him to no one in particular, said Mrs. Harmon would be in shortly, and left. He sat down. He opened his folder and uncapped his pen. He waited. Eleanor Harmon came in 3 minutes later. She was smaller than he had pictured, narrowed by the years in the way of people who were once larger in their bearing than their frame, and she moved with the deliberate care of someone who had spent 2 years learning to move carefully because she was being watched. She was wearing a dark blue cardigan over a pressed blouse, her white hair combed and pinned neatly, and she looked at Marcus across the table with gray eyes that were direct in a way that stopped him for a half second, though he did not show it. Most people, in the first moment of meeting a lawyer, looked either hopeful or afraid. Eleanor Harmon looked like she was taking his measure and intended to complete the process before she decided what to do next. He introduced himself, his name, the firm, the nature of the advocacy review, and the privacy of the meeting. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "How did you get here? Specifically?" He told her about Rosa's call to the intake line. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. Then she said, "Rosa, I've been trying to find a way to get a message out of this building for 8 months. The room phone goes through the facility system. I suspected the calls were logged. I didn't know how to test it without making myself visible in a way that would cause problems." "You were right to be careful," Marcus said. "We can talk about your communication options in a moment. First, I'd like to hear from you directly about your situation. Not what's in the file. What you want me to know." She looked at him. The measuring look again, unhurried. He sat still and let it complete. "All right," she said. "I'll tell you what I want you to know." She told him about the fall in November 2 years ago, a twisted ankle, a walking boot, 6 weeks. She told him about Gerald arriving within 24 hours of the fall, which she said now with the specific flatness of a person who has had a long time to understand what it meant. She told him about the second visit and Dr. Philip Oates and the County Elder Care Assessment Program framing, and about the moment in the second session when Diane had said, "You see what I mean, Phil," and Eleanor had understood, with the specific cold clarity of a working mind, exactly what was happening. She told him about the paperwork she had signed while on pain medication and had not understood, and about arriving at Meadow Pines in January and Gerald patting her hand at the door and driving away. She told none of it quickly. She told it the way a person tells a story they have organized carefully over a long period of time and tested for accuracy against their own memory and are now delivering in the right order so nothing important is buried. Marcus wrote as she spoke. He asked questions at the right moments: the date of the assessment, the specific name on the power of attorney forms, whether Dr. Oates had been alone or accompanied during any of the sessions. She answered everything with the same specificity she brought to the telling. At one point she paused and said, "You're still writing?" "Yes. The people who come in here and listen to me stop writing after 5 minutes," she said. "They start summarizing instead." "I don't summarize until I'm sure I have it right," Marcus said. Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile, but the loosening of something that had been held closed. She told him about the estate. Harold had built the commercial real estate portfolio over 30 years and left everything to Eleanor outright when he died. Her accountant, Raymond Chu, had valued the estate at roughly $4 million 2 years ago. She did not know its current value. She did not know what her children had done with it during the 22 months she had been in this room, though she was not naive about the possibilities. "I signed documents when I was impaired," she said. "I want to be clear about that because I want you to understand the precise nature of what happened. I was not someone with cognitive decline who made poor decisions over a long period. I was someone with full cognitive function who was incapacitated on one specific occasion when that incapacitation was useful to other people. The distinction matters." "It matters enormously," Marcus said, "and it's a distinction the documentation will need to support." She nodded. "Raymond Chu was with the Harmon accounts for 18 years. I don't know if Gerald has replaced him, but if Raymond is still reachable, he will know the real numbers. He will know what has happened to those accounts since my admission." "I'll find Raymond Chu," Marcus said. She nodded again. Something in her posture had shifted over the course of the last 40 minutes, not relaxed, exactly, but less compressed, the way a person sits differently when they have put something they've been carrying for a long time into someone else's hands for a moment. He was about to ask his next question when she paused. She looked at the window, at the bare trees and the thin March light. She seemed to be deciding whether to say something, the specific deliberateness of a person who has something to tell but is not certain of the terms. "You're around 30, she said. 32, 33. 32, Marcus said. She looked at the trees a moment longer. "My daughter Patricia died 8 years ago," she said. "She was 50. Ovarian cancer." She said it with the flatness of a grief so long carried that the sharp edges had worn down without the weight going anywhere. She was a home health aide. She spent her career taking care of elderly people in their homes. She was the kind of person who, she paused. She noticed things. She did something about them. That was who she was. Marcus had his pen on the paper. He was listening. "She had a son," Eleanor said. "My only grandchild. He would be your age now, around your age. I've never met him." She said that last sentence the way she had said other things in this room, without apology, without softening, as a plain statement of a fact she had made her peace with and had not made her peace with in the same breath. "I've thought about him a great deal lately. If I get out of here, finding him is the first thing I intend to do. If he would want to be found." She paused. "I don't know whether he would. I wouldn't blame him if he didn't." Marcus had stopped writing. He was looking at his legal pad. At the last notation he had made, Raymond Chu, estate accountant, 18 years. Below it, a blank line. He looked up at Eleanor Harmon. He said, in a voice he kept very level, "What was his name?" She looked at him. Something in the question made her look at him more carefully than she had yet looked at him. The way you look at someone when a question lands in a register you were not expecting. "Marcus," she said. "His name was Marcus Webb." The conference room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something that has been moving in one direction suddenly stops. Outside the window, the clouds had finally made their decision, and rain was coming down against the glass in a slow, steady sheet. Marcus Webb sat across a small table from Eleanor Harmon and held his pen over the legal pad and did not write anything. She was watching him. He could see the exact moment the recognition began to move across her face, the careful gray eyes that looked at him and then looked again, more precisely, taking in the shape of his features and something behind them that she was working to place. He watched her go still. He watched her hands, which had been flat on the table, lift slightly and then settle again. She said his name, not as a question, as a thing she was placing carefully against the weight of what she had just understood. "Marcus." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. The rain against the window was the only sound in the room for a long moment. Eleanor Harmon sat very still. She was looking at Marcus the way a person looks at something they have been carrying in their memory for so long that seeing it in the actual world requires a recalibration the mind does not rush. Her gray eyes moved across his face slowly, his jawline, his hands, the particular way he held his pen without gripping it, and Marcus sat still and let this happen because he understood it was necessary and because he did not know what else to do. He had known, on some level, for the last 4 minutes. Not known exactly. He had not arrived at the room with knowledge. But the pieces had been assembling themselves while he sat there listening to her. The specific quality of her attention, the way she held her grief for Patricia without performing it, and then she had said the name and the assembling was complete. He had 32 years of not knowing his grandmother's face, and now he was sitting across a small conference table from it in a facility that should not have been her home. Eleanor said, "Patricia's son." "Yes," Marcus said. She put one hand over the other on the table. A contained gesture, the kind of thing a person does when something large is moving through them, and they are choosing to hold it in rather than let it out in a room with a stranger present. He was not quite a stranger. That was the thing neither of them had the language for yet. "How long have you known," she said, "that I was here?" "I didn't know," he said, "until you said the name." He paused. "I tried to find you after my mother died. I wrote to an address I found in a directory. Nothing came back." She was quiet. Something moved across her face that was not quite pain and not quite relief, and was probably both of those things pressed together by the years between them. "Gerald," she said. Not an accusation, just a placement. The name went into the room and sat there with its own weight. "I don't know that for certain," Marcus said. "I do," Eleanor said. He looked at his legal pad. He looked at what he had written in the last hour, careful, specific notes in his own handwriting. The documentation of a case he had driven 45 minutes to take on a Thursday morning because a nurse named Rosa had filed a concern that hadn't gone anywhere through the standard channels. The documentation was real. The case was real. The woman across the table was his grandmother. And he had been sitting here for 60 minutes treating her as a client without knowing that. And now he knew it, and he needed to decide what came next before the decision was made for him by inaction. He said, "I need to be honest with you about what this means for the case." She looked at him. "I'm your attorney in this room today," he said. "Everything you've told me is protected. That doesn't change. But there's an ethical question about whether I can continue to represent you as lead counsel given our relationship, and I need to deal with it properly rather than pretend it doesn't exist." He paused. "I'm going to call my firm this afternoon and disclose the conflict. My partner Diana Caldwell has been practicing elder law for 22 years. She's better in a courtroom than I am. She will either take over the lead position or she'll serve as co-counsel for oversight. Either way, this case gets worked properly. You have my word on that." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "You drove 45 minutes this morning because a nurse filed a concern," she said, "without knowing who I was." "Yes. And you're staying on the case." "I'm staying on the case," he said, "one way or another." She looked at the window. The rain had settled into a steady, quiet fall against the glass, the kind that was not going to stop soon. When she looked back at him, something in her face had changed in a way he could not precisely name. A door that had been held mostly closed for a very long time opening, carefully, an inch. "Your mother was a good person," Eleanor said. "She was the best of what I was when I was young and better at it than I ever was, because she didn't have what I had, and she did it anyway." She paused. "I failed her. I want you to know I understand that I failed her, and that I am not going to spend whatever time we have asking you to make that easier for me than it should be." Marcus looked at her steadily. He said, "She told me you weren't a bad person. She said that when I was 14. She said you were a person who chose wrong, and that there was a difference." He paused. "She meant it. I knew her well enough to know when she meant something." Eleanor pressed her lips together briefly. She nodded once, the nod of a woman accepting something she has needed to hear and is not going to make a scene about receiving. "All right," she said. "Then let's talk about what we're going to do." They talked for another 30 minutes. By the time Marcus left the conference room, he had 3 pages of notes, the name of Raymond Chu's last known office address, a list of the specific documents Eleanor could recall signing and the approximate dates of each, and the name of a woman named Harriet Gelb who had been in the room during one of the original assessment sessions and who Eleanor believed had not fully understood at the time what she was participating in. He also had, in the inside pocket of his jacket, a small piece of paper Eleanor had torn from the corner of a facility newsletter with a phone number written on it in careful handwriting, her room phone number, which he would not call through the facility system, but which was the only number she had and which she had given him because she needed him to have it. He stopped at Rosa's station on the way out. Rosa looked at him with the expression of a woman who has learned to read rooms. "Are you taking the case?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "I'll be in touch about formal documentation. In the meantime, if anything changes with Mrs. Harmon's situation, anything at all, I want you to call the firm's direct line." He handed her his card. Rosa took it. She looked at it, and then at him. "She seemed different when she came back," she said. "From the meeting. She looked like someone who had put something down that they'd been carrying for a long time." Marcus said, "She's put down part of it." He drove back to Hayden in the rain. He called Diana Caldwell from the car, pulling over at a gas station on Route 9, because he had been taught early that calls that mattered should not happen while you were trying to do something else. Diana answered on the second ring, which she always did because she was a woman who believed that the people calling her had already waited long enough for whatever they were about to ask. He told her about the case from the beginning: Rosa's call, the assessment documentation, Dr. Oates's suspended license, the power of attorney, the estate. He told her about the conference room. He told her about Eleanor saying the name. Diana was quiet for a long moment after he finished. Then she said, "How are you?" "I'm all right," he said. "I need to know if I can stay on this. Ethically, you have to disclose and you have to make sure the representation is supervised," she said. "You know that. You also know that being related to a client is not automatic grounds for disqualification. It's a conflict that has to be managed, not one that has to eliminate you." She paused. "Marcus, how are you actually?" He looked at the rain on the windshield. "I found my grandmother in a locked room that she was put in by her children so they could spend her money," he said. "I don't know how I am yet. I know I'm not walking away from it." "No," Diana said. "You're not. Come in tomorrow morning and we'll do this formally. I'll co-counsel." You'll lead the investigation because you're already in it, and because you're good at this work. We'll document the disclosure and structure the representation correctly." She paused. "Bring everything you have." He brought everything. The next morning, Friday, he spread Rose's packet and his 3 pages of conference room notes across Diana Caldwell's desk, and walked her through all of it while she listened with the particular focused stillness she brought to cases that were going to be difficult and that she had already decided were worth the difficulty. She asked for questions. She made 2 notes. She said at the end, "Philip Oates did 3 assessments in this county in the 18 months before his license was pulled. I want to know who referred all 3. "So do I," Marcus said. They filed the formal conflict disclosure that afternoon with the firm's records. Diana Caldwell was designated supervising co-counsel. Marcus Webb was designated lead attorney on the Eleanor Harmon matter. It was recorded and dated and entirely proper. He went back to Meadow Pines the following Thursday. This time, Rosa met him at the side entrance rather than the lobby and walked him to Eleanor's room rather than the conference room, because they had agreed, he and Eleanor, that the conference room made the visits look official and official visits were the ones that got noted. Rosa knocked on the door of room 118 and said she was just checking in, as she often did on Thursdays, and stepped back when Eleanor opened the door and saw Marcus standing in the hallway. Eleanor looked at him for a moment without saying anything. She had the expression of a person who had been telling themselves for a week that something was real and was only now confirming it. "Come in," she said. The room was smaller than the conference room and more honest. A single bed made with hospital corners, a small dresser with a few framed photographs he did not let himself look at directly yet, a chair by the window that looked out over the parking lot, a stack of books on the nightstand with the worn Dickens novel on top. The room of a woman who had organized a limited space with the care of someone who understood that the care itself was a form of resistance. He sat in the chair by the window. She sat on the edge of the bed, and they looked at each other across the small room with the specific awkwardness of 2 people who have a great deal to say and are not certain of the order. "I kept thinking about what you said," Eleanor said. "About Patricia. What she told you." "She meant it," Marcus said. "She talked about you the way people talk about things that still matter, even when they're trying not to let them." Eleanor was quiet. She looked at her hands. "She was the best thing I did," she said. "And I let her go and told myself it was her choice, and it was mine too, and that those 2 things could both be true and the damage could still be no one's fault." She paused. "That was a position I held for a very long time. I'm no longer holding it." Marcus did not say anything to smooth this over. He let it be what it was. He thought his mother would have done the same. After a moment, Eleanor looked up. "Tell me what you found." He told her what he had so far, the referral pattern for Dr. Oates, the cross-reference between Oates's other 2 assessments in the county, and a name that appeared on all 3 referrals, a consulting firm called Harmon Advisory Group that had been registered in Delaware 6 years ago. A firm that bore a name Eleanor recognized and that had not existed, to her knowledge, when Harold was alive. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Eleanor looked at him steadily when he said the name. "Gerald registered a company," she said. "Under Harold's family name, yes." The company received referral fees from 2 other care facilities in the county during the period when Oates was conducting assessments. He paused. "The 3rd facility is Meadow Pines." She was very still for a long moment. Then she said, "How much?" "The records I have access to at this stage show payments totaling about $60,000 over 14 months. He paused. "That's what I can see now. It's not the full picture. The full picture is what Raymond Chu is going to give us." She nodded slowly. "Find Raymond," she said. "He's a careful man. He will have kept records that Gerald didn't ask him to keep." Marcus found Raymond Chu the following week. Raymond Chu was 67 years old, semi-retired, and living in a small house in Bexley with a home office that still had 4 filing cabinets in it. He had left his practice 2 years ago and had taken exactly 2 ongoing clients with him, both of them long-standing relationships he did not want to end abruptly. He was a precise, undemonstrative man who kept color-coded tabs on every folder and who answered his phone with his full name, which Marcus had noticed as a specific signal of a person who believed in the value of being exactly who they said they were. Marcus reached him on a Tuesday afternoon. He identified himself and said he was calling about Eleanor Harmon. Raymond Chu was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I've been expecting this call for about a year. I didn't know who would be making it." He agreed to a meeting. He chose a coffee shop in Bexley rather than his home, because he said he wanted to be able to see the parking lot, which Marcus understood to mean he wanted to be able to see whether Gerald Harmon had followed anyone. Marcus arrived early and found a table near the window, and Raymond Chu arrived 4 minutes later looking carefully at the room before he sat down. He was a trim man with silver-rimmed glasses and the manner of someone who has spent 40 years being trusted with other people's financial lives and who takes that trust as a fact of his character rather than a professional posture. He ordered coffee and looked at Marcus across the table with the evaluating eye of a man who assesses things for a living. "You're not from a large firm," he said. "Small firm in Hayden. Elder law." "Good," Raymond said. "Large firms in this county have connections I don't want involved in this conversation." He opened the briefcase he had brought and set a manila folder on the table without handing it over yet. "What do you know so far?" Marcus told him. Raymond listened with his hands folded over the folder, and when Marcus finished, he nodded once and said, "You have the outline. I have the interior." He had left the Harmon accounts not by choice, but by a managed pressure campaign that Gerald had conducted over the 18 months following Eleanor's admission to Meadow Pines. Gerald had first requested that Raymond copy all communications regarding the estate to a secondary contact, who turned out to be Diane. Raymond had found this irregular but had complied, informing Eleanor directly at the time or attempting to, he said, because his letter to Eleanor at the facility had received no reply, which he had attributed to her health. When he now understood she had simply not received it, his expression went flat in the way of a man who is adding a new item to a list he has been keeping of things that are going to be corrected. Gerald had then introduced a co-advisor, a financial consultant named Brett Aldersham whom Raymond had never heard of and who, when Raymond requested his credentials, had produced a certificate from an institution that did not appear in any directory Raymond could locate. Raymond had told Gerald he was not comfortable with a co-advisor whose credentials he could not verify. Gerald had told Raymond, pleasantly, that the estate was entering a new management phase and that Raymond's services would no longer be required at the conclusion of the current quarter. Raymond had been given 6 weeks' notice. He had spent those 6 weeks making copies of every document he had authority to copy. He had placed those copies in his filing cabinet under a tab he had labeled Harmon Archival, because he was a precise man who documented his own decisions the same way he documented everything else. He opened the folder and turned it toward Marcus. The estate at the time of Eleanor's admission was valued at $4,210,000, he said. Liquid assets, property holdings, and Harold's remaining investment portfolio. He tapped the top page. "I can tell you with confidence what the estate was worth on the day I left. What has happened to it since? I can give you only my projections based on the decisions Gerald was already making when I was still in the room." The decisions Gerald had been making included the sale of 2 investment properties from Harold's portfolio at below market value, in transactions where the purchasing entity was a company in which Diane Harmon held a minority stake. They included a series of management fees drawn from the estate's liquid holdings by Harmon Advisory Group, the Delaware company Marcus had already identified totaling, in Raymond's records, $312,000 in 14 months. They included the transfer of 1 property, a commercial building on the east side of Columbus that Harold had owned for 30 years and that Raymond valued at $800,000, to a holding company registered in Gerald's wife's name for a transfer price of $1, structured as an intra-family transaction. Marcus read the pages while Raymond sat quietly with his coffee. He read them with the focused stillness he brought to documents that required him to hold his own reaction until he had the complete picture. When he reached the last page, he set it down and looked at Raymond Chu across the table. "There's more," Raymond said. "What I've given you is what I directly witnessed. Aldersham, the co-advisor Gerald brought in, has been managing the remaining portfolio since I left. I don't have access to what that portfolio looks like now. I can estimate." He paused. "My estimate is that the estate has lost between 30 and 40% of its value in 22 months. Not from market forces." Marcus said, "What was your understanding of the power of attorney that was in place?" Raymond said, "I was told Eleanor had signed a durable." Power of attorney authorizing Gerald to manage her financial affairs during her incapacity. He paused. I asked to see the document. Gerald told me it was with the estate attorney. I asked for the estate attorney's contact information. I was given a name, Price Whitman, a firm in downtown Columbus, and a phone number that went to voicemail every time I called. He looked at Marcus. I should have pushed harder. I want to say that plainly. I was being managed out, and I had a clear picture of what was happening, and I made the calculation that fighting it would be expensive and would likely fail, and I made the wrong calculation, and I am prepared to do whatever I can now to correct it. I'll need a formal statement, Marcus said, and everything in those filing cabinets that relates to this estate. It's already organized, Raymond said. I've been organizing it for a year. He drove back to Hayden with Raymond Chu's folder on the passenger seat and the weight of what was in it sitting in his chest in the specific way that cases settled when they went from an outline to a full structure, when the thing you suspected became the thing you could prove. It was not a good feeling, and it was not a bad feeling. It was the feeling of understanding what you were up against, which was always preferable to not understanding it, even when what you were up against was large. He called Diana from the car, pulled over again at the same gas station on Route 9. How bad, Diana said. Gerald and Diane have been systematically draining the estate since Eleanor was admitted, he said. Below-market property sales to entities they control. Management fees from a shell company Gerald registered under Harold's name. A property transfer for $1. He paused. Raymond Chu has the documentation. He's been holding it for a year waiting for someone to ask. Diana was quiet for a moment. Do you know who drafted the power of attorney? A firm called Price Whitman in Columbus. Raymond could never reach them. Price Whitman dissolved 18 months ago, Diana said. I know the name. The principal, a man named Leonard Price, surrendered his license last fall. There were 2 other complaints pending when he surrendered, neither of which was this one. She paused. Marcus, if that power of attorney was drafted by Price under Gerald's direction at the same time Gerald was arranging Eleanor's placement, the whole structure was fraudulent from the beginning. This is not just financial abuse. This is elder fraud with a coordinated legal component. I know, Marcus said. We need to file, Diana said, a formal complaint with the County Adult Protective Services and a civil action simultaneously. And we need to do it before Gerald figures out what we have, because the moment he figures out what we have, those remaining assets are going to move. How long do you need to prepare the filings? A week, Diana said. Maybe 9 days. Can you hold it together for 9 days? Yes, Marcus said. He visited Eleanor on Saturday, not a scheduled visit, just to drive to Meadow Pines on a gray afternoon because he had found that the week between formal visits felt longer than it should, and he wanted to check. Rosa let him in through the side entrance. Eleanor was at her window with the crossword, already finished, folded in the specific way she folded completed crosswords, the grid visible, the pen resting on top. She looked up when he came in and moved the crossword to the nightstand and said, "Sit down." He sat in the chair. She sat on the edge of the bed. The afternoon light was pale and flat and came through the window at the particular angle of late February that did not quite reach the corners of the room. "Tell me where we are," she said. He told her about Raymond Chu. He told her about the properties, the management fees, the dollar transfer. He told her about Price Whitman. He told her clearly and without softening it, because she had asked for clarity and because she was a woman who had been denied accurate information for 2 years, and treating her now as someone who needed protection from the truth would be a specific kind of disrespect he was not willing to offer her. She listened to all of it with her hands folded in her lap. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "The building on the east side," she said finally. "Harold bought that property the year Gerald was born. He used to take Gerald there on Saturdays when Gerald was small to walk the building and explain how it worked. He wanted Gerald to understand what went into it." She paused. Gerald sold it for $1 to his wife's company. She said it without breaking. The specific flatness of a woman who has already grieved most of what she needed to grieve and has arrived, through that grief, at something on the other side of it that resembles clarity. "I want you to do something for me," she said, "before we file anything." Marcus looked at her. "I want Diane to have the chance to step away," Eleanor said. "She's not a good person and she's done a bad thing, and she's going to face consequences for it. I understand that. But she was not the one who arranged Dr. Oates. She was not the one who registered the shell company. She came in behind Gerald's structure the way she always came in behind whatever structure Gerald built. And I know that does not excuse her, but I want to give her the option of separating herself from him before the filing makes that impossible. I want her to be asked. I want her to have the choice. Marcus thought about this. He said, if we contact Diane before we file, Gerald will know we're coming. Diane won't tell Gerald, Eleanor said. She has never protected Gerald from anything in her life. She has protected herself. If she understands that the filing is coming and that she has a window to step away, she will step away. She will do it for entirely selfish reasons, and it will still be the right thing, and the end result will be the same. Marcus looked at her. He thought about a woman who had been sitting in this room for 22 months and who had used that time to think, very carefully, about the people who had put her here and about the difference between what was punishable and what was correctable. I'll think about how to do it cleanly, he said. Good, Eleanor said. She turned to look at the window for a moment. The parking lot was mostly empty on a Saturday afternoon. You look like her, she said, without turning back. Around the eyes. The way you hold still when you're thinking. She paused. I've been looking at you every Thursday, trying to figure out which things are from her, and which things are from your father, and which things are just you. Marcus looked at her profile against the pale window light. He said, she looked like you. I didn't know that until I walked in here, but she did. Eleanor turned from the window and looked at him. It was a full look, the kind that takes in everything at once without the careful sequencing of her earlier assessments. She looked at him the way his mother used to look at him sometimes when she thought he wasn't paying attention, with the specific, exhausted gladness of someone who finds something they were afraid they had lost. Yes, she said softly. She did. The letter from Gerald Harmon's attorney arrived at Caldwell and Raines on a Monday morning, 9 days after Marcus's meeting with Raymond Chu. It was 4 pages on the letterhead of a firm called Whitfield and Associates, and it was addressed to Diana Caldwell, not to Marcus, which meant Gerald already knew Marcus was involved and had made a calculation about who to address. The letter stated that the firm had been retained by Gerald Harmon in connection with recent inquiries regarding the estate of Gerald Harmon, that the Harmon family was aware of an unauthorized legal consultation that had been conducted with Eleanor Harmon at Meadow Pines Care Center without the knowledge or consent of her designated power of attorney, and that any further contact with Eleanor Harmon by attorneys at Caldwell and Raines would be considered a violation of the fiduciary arrangement in place and would be addressed accordingly. The letter also contained a paragraph, the 4th, that Marcus read twice and then set down on his desk and looked at for a moment before he continued. The paragraph stated that the firm was in possession of information suggesting that the attorney in question, Marcus Webb, had represented himself to Eleanor Harmon under potentially misleading circumstances, and that this misrepresentation would be raised in any subsequent proceedings as evidence of undue influence. The misrepresentation, in Gerald Harmon's framing, was Marcus being Patricia's son, a fact he had not hidden and had disclosed to his own firm as a conflict, a fact Gerald was now attempting to convert into a weapon. Diana came to his office doorway while he was still looking at the letter. She had her copy in her hand. He knows who you are, she said. Yes. He's going to try to make your relationship to Eleanor look like manipulation. Yes, Marcus said. He's going to try. He looked up from the desk. Are we ready to file? Diana looked at him. I've been ready for 6 days, she said. I was waiting for you to be ready. File today, Marcus said. Diana went back to her office. Marcus sat at his desk and thought about the 4th paragraph and about Gerald Harmon's calculation that a grandson discovering his grandmother was the kind of emotional story that could be made to look like something else if the person doing the reframing had good enough lawyers. He thought about Eleanor in room 118 saying that Gerald would not have told him the letter hadn't reached her. He thought about a man who had watched his mother read case after case about people like this, people who converted family into leverage and called it management, and who had spent 4 years of his professional life sitting in rooms with the people on the other side of that conversion. He thought about Patricia Webb, who had died at 50 in the apartment on Garfield Street, and who had told her son, when he was 14, that Eleanor was not a bad person but a person who chose wrong, and that the difference mattered. He thought about what Patricia would have done in this room, with this letter, and he thought she would have done exactly what he was going to do, which was set the letter aside and focus on what came next. His phone rang at 2:17 that afternoon. The call came from the front desk at Caldwell and Raines. where the receptionist, a young woman named Beth, said there was a man in the lobby who did not have an appointment and had asked for Diana Caldwell, and then, when told Diana was unavailable, had asked for Marcus Webb. Beth said the man had given his name as Gerald Harmon. Marcus set down his pen. He thought about Eleanor in the conference room, saying Gerald had arrived within 24 hours of her fall. He thought about the letter with the fourth paragraph. He thought about what you learned about a person from the way they moved when they thought they had the upper hand, and about what you learned about them from the way they moved when they didn't. He said, "Tell him I'll be out in a few minutes." He straightened the files on his desk and uncapped his pen and wrote one final note in the margin of his legal pad. He capped the pen. He stood up, took his jacket from the back of the chair, put it on. He walked down the hallway to the lobby of Caldwell and Raines, and Gerald Harmon was standing near the reception desk in a dark overcoat that had cost a great deal of money. And he turned when Marcus came through the door and looked at him with an expression Marcus recognized immediately. It was the expression of a man who had arrived having already written the scene in his own mind, and who was currently absorbing the gap between the scene he had written and the one that was actually in front of him. Gerald Harmon was looking at the face of Patricia Webb's son. He was looking at Eleanor's eyes in a younger face and Harold's jaw, and something else underneath both of those, something that was simply itself, the specific quality of a person who has spent a long time paying attention and who is paying attention now and who is not going to be managed today. "Mr. Harmon," Marcus said. Gerald looked at him for a moment longer. When he spoke, his voice was controlled and smooth in the specific way of a man who has practiced speaking under pressure. "Mr. Webb," he said, "I think you and I should have a conversation." "I think so too," Marcus said. "My colleague Diana Caldwell will be joining us." He looked at Gerald steadily. "We can use the conference room." He turned and walked back toward the conference room without waiting to see whether Gerald followed. He did not need to look back to know that he did. Gerald Harmon was 61 years old and looked younger than that in the specific way of men who have spent their lives in comfortable rooms. He had his father's height and a version of his father's bearing that was mostly surface the posture without the substance underneath it, the way a house can look solid from the street while the load-bearing walls have been quietly compromised. He sat down at the conference room table at Caldwell and Raines and placed his phone face down in front of him and looked across at Marcus and Diana Caldwell with the composed expression of a man who had decided in advance that this meeting was going to go the way he had decided it would go. Diana sat to Marcus's left with a legal pad and a pen and the particular stillness she brought to rooms where someone else was performing confidence. She had been practicing elder law for 22 years, and she had sat across from men like Gerald Harmon with some regularity, and she had learned, through those years, that the most effective posture was simply to let them begin. She let him begin. Gerald said he wanted to start by acknowledging the unusual circumstances of the situation. He said that he understood Marcus had recently learned that he and Eleanor were related, which he said was a genuinely surprising development, and that he wanted Marcus to know there was no animosity from the family's side toward Marcus personally. He said the situation with Eleanor was a complicated one, that outsiders, he used that word carefully, with a small pause before it, did not always have the full context to evaluate fairly. He said Eleanor's placement at Meadow Pines had been made out of genuine concern for her well-being following a fall that had frightened the entire family, and that Gerald had made decisions that he believed, in good faith, were what his mother needed. He talked for 4 minutes without being interrupted, which was exactly what Diana intended. Marcus wrote in the margins of his legal pad and did not look up often, which was also exactly what Diana intended. She had told him in the hallway before they came in, "Let him build the structure. We take it apart after it's built. It's easier that way." When Gerald finished, Diana said, "Thank you for coming in, Mr. Harmon. I have a few questions." She opened her folder. "The physician who conducted your mother's cognitive assessment in November 2 years ago was Dr. Philip Oates. Is that correct?" Gerald said yes. Dr. Oates's license was suspended 16 months ago by the state medical board for falsifying assessment documentation in a case in Franklin County. Were you aware of that at the time of the assessment? Gerald said he had not been aware of any issues with Dr. Oates's licensure at the time, and that he had engaged Dr. Oates based on a referral he had received in good faith. Diana wrote something. The referral came through Harmon Advisory Group. Gerald's expression shifted slightly. The first adjustment. "I'm not sure I understand the question." Harmon Advisory Group is a consulting firm registered in Delaware that you incorporated 6 years ago, Diana said. Between the month of your mother's admission to Meadow Pines and 14 months following that admission, Harmon Advisory Group received referral fee payments from 3 care facilities in this county, including Meadow Pines. Dr. Oates conducted assessments in connection with all 3 of those facilities. Were those referrals generated through your company? The room was quiet for a moment. Gerald looked at Marcus, who was writing in his legal pad, and had not looked up. Then he looked at Diana. I'd like to be clear that I came here today to have a productive conversation, not to answer interrogatories, he said. Of course, Diana said pleasantly. These are informal questions. You're not compelled to answer any of them. She paused. Though I should tell you that the Adult Protective Services complaint we filed this morning at 9:15 does compel answers, in a different setting. Gerald was still for a beat. Then he said, You filed this morning. At 9:15, Diana said. Marcus looked up from his legal pad for the first time since the conversation had begun. He looked at Gerald Harmon across the table. He looked at him the way he looked at documents that required careful attention steadily, without hurry, taking in all of it. Gerald looked at Marcus, and Marcus could see him making a recalculation. He was looking at Marcus's face and doing what Eleanor had done that first Thursday in the conference room at Meadow Pines, looking at something he had not expected to have to account for. The difference was that Eleanor had looked with recognition. Gerald was looking with something that was closer to the specific discomfort of a man who has spent his life managing situations and who has walked into a room and found that the situation has already been managed. I would like to speak with you privately, Gerald said to Marcus. As a family matter. Whatever professional obligations you have, I'm asking you to step outside them for 10 minutes and have a conversation as a family member. I don't step outside my professional obligations, Marcus said. In any room. Gerald looked at him. Your mother was a troubled woman, Marcus. She struggled with a great many things her entire life. I'm sorry if the family didn't do more to help her. I mean that sincerely. But the fact that she was my half-sister doesn't mean that everything you've been told about this situation is accurate. Eleanor is a 78-year-old woman with documented cognitive decline who has formed an attachment to a young attorney who is, among other things, a blood relative with a potential financial interest in her estate. You should consider very carefully how that looks to a judge. Marcus held Gerald's gaze. He said, Eleanor had no documented cognitive decline before Dr. Oates' assessment. Dr. Oates is a physician whose license was suspended for exactly this type of documentation. Your company received referral fees connected to exactly this type of assessment. The power of attorney was drafted by an attorney, Leonard Price, who surrendered his license while facing unrelated misconduct charges and whose firm has since dissolved. He paused. As for how it looks to a judge, I think a judge is going to look at all of that before they look at me. Gerald turned to Diana. You should know that my attorneys are going to challenge the conflict of interest in this representation very aggressively, he said. Whatever emotional claim your associate has to this case, the representation is compromised and you know it. Diana said. We disclosed the relationship to the bar on the same day we became aware of it, documented the disclosure with a date stamp, and structured the co-counsel arrangement precisely to address any conflict. If your attorneys want to bring that challenge, they're welcome to spend the next 4 months on it. She paused. In the meantime, the APS investigation proceeds independently of our representation. Gerald looked at her. He looked at Marcus. He picked up his phone from the table, stood, and buttoned his coat. He said, This is going to be a long and expensive process for everyone, including my mother. He said it the way people say things they want to sound like a warning, but which are actually a statement of what they are prepared to do. It doesn't have to be, Marcus said. Gerald looked at him. Eleanor asked me to give you the opportunity to end this cleanly, Marcus said. That offer is on the table until we receive your response to the APS complaint. After that, we're past the point where any of it is clean. He paused. She's your mother. Whatever you've done, she's your mother, and she is asking you through me to stop. Something moved through Gerald Harmon's face that was not quite readable. Not remorse, not quite. Something adjacent to it. The specific expression of a person who has just been told that the person they wronged has been thinking about them and has chosen not to hate them, and who does not entirely know what to do with that. He left without saying anything more. Marcus and Diana sat in the conference room after he was gone. Diana looked at the door and then at her legal pad. She said, "He's not going to stop." "No," Marcus said. But Eleanor needed to have given him the chance. Diana looked at him. "Your grandmother is a formidable woman." "Yes," Marcus said. "She always was." He called Diane Harmon that evening from his apartment at 7:30, after he had made dinner, and let the day settle enough that he could approach the conversation with the steadiness it required. He had Eleanor's direction in mind. Give Diane the window before it closes. And he had Raymond choose documents in front of him on the kitchen table, and he had Diana Caldwell's note from the afternoon, which said, "If she's going to move, she'll move fast. She knows the shape of this better than Gerald does." Diane answered on the fourth ring. She had a careful voice, lower than he had expected, and she waited for him to identify himself before she said anything at all. When he did, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I was wondering when someone was going to call me directly." "Your brother came to my office today," Marcus said. "He's not going to take my client's offer." Diane said, "He never has taken any offer that wasn't entirely on his own terms." She paused. "What does the offer include?" Marcus told her. "The estate recovery process, the civil action, the APS investigation. What Diane's exposure looked like as a party to the property transactions. What it would look like if she cooperated now versus what it would look like if she was named as a correspondent in the civil filing." Diane listened to all of it. Then she said, "The arrangement with Dr. Oates. That was Gerald. I want to be clear about that. I knew he was using a doctor to get the assessment he needed, but the arrangement was Gerald's, and the referral fee company was Gerald's." She paused. "I didn't stop it. I want to be honest with you about that. I knew what was happening, and I told myself the placement was the right thing for Eleanor, and I did not examine that very carefully." "I understand," Marcus said. "What do you need from me?" "Documentation," Marcus said. "Anything you have in writing that establishes the sequence. When Gerald first proposed the arrangement, any communications about Oates, any communications about the power of attorney or Price Whitman. Anything you have." Another pause. "I have emails," she said. "Gerald used email for things he should have called about. He always has." She paused again, longer this time. "She's all right? My mother." Marcus thought about Eleanor at the window of room 118, the crossword folded on the nightstand, the Dickens novel with the photograph still between pages 112 and 113. He said, "She's all right. She's been waiting for someone to come." Diane said, "She would wait. She would sit in that room and wait because she has more patience than anyone I have ever known, and she has never in her life given up on something she believed in." A pause that had a different quality than the ones before it, longer, slightly unsteady. "She believed Gerald and I would come around eventually. I don't know why she believed that, given us, but she did." She stopped. "Send me what you need me to sign." Diane Harmon sent 47 emails over the following 4 days. They arrived in batches through her personal attorney, a woman named Sylvia Park who had represented Diane in her divorce 9 years earlier and who called Diana Caldwell before the first batch arrived to say that her client was cooperating fully, that her client understood the nature of her own exposure and was prepared to address it through a cooperation agreement, and that her client had one condition. The condition was that a copy of every filing that mentioned Eleanor Harmon's name would be sent to Diane directly. She wanted to know what happened. Diana agreed to the condition without consulting Marcus because she knew he would have agreed immediately. The 47 emails were, as Diane had promised, exactly what they needed. They included 3 exchanges between Gerald and Leonard Price, the dissolved attorney, discussing the language of the power of attorney and specifically how to structure it so that Eleanor could sign it while impaired without the impairment being apparent from the document itself. They included 2 exchanges between Gerald and a man named Dale Cook, who turned out to be the business manager of Harmon Advisory Group, discussing the referral fee arrangement with Meadow Pines and the other 2 facilities. They included 1 exchange, sent the week before Eleanor was transferred to Meadow Pines, in which Gerald wrote to Diane, "She signs Thursday. After Thursday, we don't have to manage this anymore." Diane had replied with a single word, "Good." Marcus read that exchange on a Thursday morning and sat with it for a while. He thought about Eleanor reading that, if she ever did. He thought about what it cost a person to be reduced to a problem someone was tired of managing. He thought about his mother, and about all the Helens and Eleanors his mother had sat with and had seen and had not looked away from. and about the specific quality of person it took to keep looking when the world made it easy not to. He went to Meadow Pines that afternoon and told Eleanor about the emails. She listened. When he got to the last exchange, she signs Thursday. After Thursday, we don't have to manage this anymore. She looked at the window for a long time without speaking. He let the silence be what it was. Finally, she said, he wrote that to Diane. Yes. She was quiet again. Then she said, when I was a girl, I watched my own mother choose my father's comfort over every difficult thing that needed to be done. She was not a cruel woman. She was a woman who found the path of least resistance and stayed on it her whole life and called it keeping the peace. She paused. I did the same thing with Patricia. I kept the peace. I chose the path that cost me nothing and called it something else. She turned from the window to look at him. Gerald learned that from somewhere. Marcus looked at her. He said, he made choices. Whatever he learned, he made choices. Yes, Eleanor said. He did. She folded her hands in her lap. And now so do I. The APS investigation moved in the methodical way of official processes that have been given everything they need and are now working through the proper channels. The investigator assigned was a woman named Claire Osei who had been in Adult Protective Services for 11 years and who called Marcus on the second day of the investigation to tell him that she had reviewed the documentation and that what she had seen was one of the cleaner cases she had encountered in terms of the evidence trail, which she said not as a compliment exactly, but as an acknowledgement of the specificity of what Raymond Chu and Diane had provided. She asked 3 questions. Marcus answered them. She told him to expect a finding within 60 days. Gerald retained a firm called Brower and Kelsch with 4 partners and offices in Columbus and Cincinnati. Brower and Kelsch filed 3 motions in the first 10 days: a challenge to Marcus's standing, a challenge to the APS investigation's jurisdiction, and an emergency motion to prevent any action on the estate assets pending resolution of what they called the contested fiduciary arrangement. The standing challenge cited Marcus's family relationship to Eleanor and his potential interest in her estate as grounds for disqualification. Diana responded to all 3 within 48 hours, and the standing challenge was denied by the judge, Judge Patricia Wren, who read Diana's response and said from the bench with the brevity of someone who has seen this particular tactic before, counsel disclosed the relationship on the day of discovery. The co-counsel structure is properly documented, and a relationship between an attorney and a client does not constitute a conflict requiring disqualification absent evidence of actual prejudice to the client. Motion denied. She said the last 2 words with a slight pause between them that communicated clearly that she did not expect to address this issue again. The emergency asset protection motion was granted, which Marcus had expected and Diana had prepared for. It froze the remaining estate assets in place, which meant Gerald could not move anything else, which was the outcome they had wanted from the moment Diana filed. Brower and Kelsch then shifted to the capacity argument, which was the one Marcus had been waiting for. They commissioned their own cognitive assessment of Eleanor, which they were entitled to under the proceedings, and the assessment was conducted by a physician named Dr. Andrew Scheck, who came to Meadow Pines on a Tuesday with 2 colleagues and spent 3 hours with Eleanor in the same conference room where Marcus had first met her. Eleanor told Marcus afterward that Dr. Scheck had been thorough and professional and had asked her, at one point, to explain the mechanics of compound interest, which she had done, and then to explain the provisions of the Fifth Amendment, which she had also done, and then to describe the plot of the last novel she had read. She had described the Dickens, chapter by chapter, from memory. She said Dr. Scheck had written something in his folder at that point and had not asked further questions about the novel. Dr. Scheck's assessment found no evidence of cognitive impairment. Gerald's capacity argument collapsed before it reached a hearing. What followed was 6 weeks of the kind of legal process that moves steadily and without drama, the kind where the outcome has been substantially determined by the evidence, and the remaining work is the precise documentation of what was already established. Marcus drove to Hayden and back to Meadow Pines, and to Columbus to meet with Raymond Chu twice more, and to the county courthouse 4 times. He talked to Eleanor every Thursday and called her on the room phone on Tuesday evenings, timing the calls for after 8, when the front desk staffing was thinner and the calls were less likely to be checked. He had no actual evidence that the calls were being monitored, but Eleanor had believed they were, and he saw no reason to give Gerald anything he could use, however small. The APS finding came in 53 days. It substantiated elder financial abuse, fraud in the procurement of a durable power of attorney, and exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The finding referred the matter to the county prosecutor's office for criminal review. The county prosecutor's office assigned the case to a senior attorney named Mark Felton, who called Marcus 2 days after the referral and said he had read the full APS file and Raymond Chu's documentation and Diane's cooperation agreement, and that this was, in his words, not a complicated case on the evidence. The complicated part is going to be managing the press when it comes out, because it's going to come out. It came out. A reporter from a Columbus business publication had been monitoring the probate court filings and ran a story that described the case accurately, without naming Marcus, and described Eleanor as a widow who had been placed in a care facility under a fraudulent cognitive assessment to allow her stepchildren to drain her estate. The story ran on a Thursday. By the following Monday, 2 other outlets had picked it up. Brower and Kelsch sent a letter to the prosecutor's office calling the coverage prejudicial. The prosecutor did not respond to the letter. Gerald Harmon was charged with elder financial abuse, fraud, and exploitation of a vulnerable adult in the 2nd month after the APS finding. He rejected the first plea offer, retained a second firm in addition to Brower and Kelsch, and spent 3 weeks telling the business publication in a follow-up story that the charges were the result of a coordinated effort by a conflicted attorney with a personal agenda. The story ran the day before Judge Wren issued a scheduling order that set a trial date. Brower and Kelsch called Diana the following morning and said Gerald was ready to discuss terms. The terms took 3 weeks to finalize. Gerald pleaded to a reduced charge of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, a felony, and agreed to a restitution order requiring the return of all identifiable estate assets and the cash equivalent of those that had been transferred or dissipated. He received a suspended sentence of 2 years and 5 years probation. He was removed from any fiduciary role in relation to Eleanor's estate permanently. He was not required to sell the house on Persimmon Lane because the house had not been successfully transferred. Gerald had listed it for sale 8 months into Eleanor's stay at Meadow Pines and had received 2 offers, both of which required Eleanor's signature, which he had been in the process of manufacturing through a notary arrangement that the APS investigation had uncovered and which was now one of the items in the restitution order. The house was still Eleanor's. Diane Harmon entered into a civil agreement separate from Gerald's criminal proceedings. She returned the funds she had received through the property transactions and paid an additional civil judgment that Marcus had negotiated down to a number Diane could meet without declaring bankruptcy, which Eleanor had asked for specifically. Diane is not her brother, Eleanor had told Marcus during one of their Tuesday calls. She followed him. That's not the same thing as being him. I want her to have to face what she did. I don't want her destroyed by it. There is a difference, and I want it honored. Marcus had honored it. The day the plea was finalized, Marcus drove to Meadow Pines after the courthouse and walked through the side entrance and past Rosa's station and knocked on the door of room 118. Eleanor opened the door. She was wearing the dark blue cardigan, the same one she had worn the first Thursday he came, and she looked at his face and read what was in it the way she read everything without rushing it, taking in all of it. "It's done," she said. "It's done," Marcus said. She stepped back from the door, and he came in and sat in the chair by the window, and she sat on the edge of the bed. And neither of them said anything for a while. Outside the window, the parking lot had the particular quality of a late spring afternoon, the light longer now, something in the air that was different from the gray February morning he had first pulled into that lot and sat in his car for 30 seconds making sure he knew what he was going to do. Eleanor said, "When can I go home?" 2 weeks, he said. "Maybe 3. There's some paperwork on the estate side, and we need to have the house checked over before you go in. It's been 23 months. I want to make sure everything is in order." Eleanor nodded. She turned to look at the window and at the parking lot that had been her clock for 2 years. "The garden is going to need work," she said. "Yes," Marcus said. "I don't mind that," she said. "I've always thought a garden that needed work was more interesting than one that didn't." She paused. "Harold planted the oak tree in the backyard the year we bought the house. It's probably enormous now." She paused again. "I want to see it." "You will," Marcus said. She turned from the window to look at him. The gray eyes that had taken his measure the first Thursday and had been doing it every Thursday since. the assessment that had become over the months something else, something that was not the same as the careful distance of two strangers building a professional relationship, something warmer and less symmetrical, the way relationships between people who share blood and shared loss tend to build when they are given room to build. "I want to say something to you," Eleanor said. "Before we leave this room. I want to say it here because this is where it started, and I think it should be said here." Marcus waited. "You drove 45 minutes on a Thursday morning in March because a nurse called a legal firm's intake line and no one else had called back," Eleanor said. "You didn't know who I was. You didn't know you had any reason to be here beyond the case. You came because a woman was in a room she shouldn't have been in and no one else had come." She paused. "I want you to understand that everything that happened after the case, Gerald, the house, any of it was already decided in that moment. The moment you picked up the phone." She looked at him steadily. "Your mother raised someone who picks up the phone." Marcus looked at her. He thought about Patricia Webb in the kitchen on Garfield Street, saying she's not a bad person. She's a person who chose wrong. And about the specific quality of someone who carries a complicated grief without letting it harden into something that would make the carrying easier, but the person smaller. He thought about Rosa Mendez's voice on the intake line, careful and unhurried, saying she had been a nurse for 22 years and was not someone who made calls like this lightly. He thought about a 78-year-old woman doing a crossword in pen in a parking lot room, waiting. "She raised someone who tries," Marcus said. "I don't always get it right." "No one does," Eleanor said. "The trying is the thing." The morning Eleanor left Meadow Pines was a Friday in June. Marcus brought his car to the side entrance at 9 in the morning, and Rosa Mendez was there to see Eleanor out, which Eleanor had asked for specifically. Rosa hugged Eleanor briefly and without ceremony, the hug of a woman who has spent 2 years watching someone be erased and who found a way to do something about it and who is not going to make a speech about it. And Eleanor held on for a moment longer than Marcus expected and then stepped back and said, "Thank you, Rosa. You knew what you were looking at." Rosa said, "You made it easy. You never stopped being yourself." Eleanor looked at her for a moment with the gray eyes that had looked at so many things in this hallway over 2 years. Then she said, "Come visit when you can," and walked out to Marcus's car. He drove with the windows down because the June morning was the kind that asked for it. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat and looked at the road and at the sky and at the town they passed through and at everything with the specific full attention of a person who has been inside for a long time and is now recalibrating to the world outside. She did not talk much on the drive. Marcus did not talk much either. They were not people who filled silence that did not need filling. They came down Persimmon Lane at 10:14 in the morning. The street was quiet. The trees along the lane were full and green, the particular green of Ohio in June, heavy and saturated after a wet spring. Eleanor was looking out the window as they came down the block, and Marcus watched her the way you watch a person in the moment before something happens that is going to matter. She saw the house and went still. It was a 4-bedroom colonial, white with green shutters, set back from the street behind a lawn that had grown long and uneven in the months since anyone had maintained it. The flower beds along the front walk were overgrown. One shutter on the second floor was slightly crooked. The driveway had a crack running from the apron to the door of the garage that had not been there, Marcus suspected, in 2001 when Harold had last sealed it. The house looked like what it was, a place that had been waiting and that had not been tended while it waited. It also looked, he thought, exactly like a place that was still there. Eleanor got out of the car before he had fully stopped. She stood on the front walk and looked at the house for a long time, her hands at her sides. Marcus came to stand beside her, and he did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the moment was not already saying. She walked up to the front door. He had the key. It had been in the estate documents, the original key to the house, and he gave it to her, and she unlocked the door herself. The house smelled of closed rooms and dust and something underneath both of those that was specific and familiar in the way of places that have been a home for a long time. The hallway was dim. The living room was intact, the furniture still in place, Harold's books still in the bookcase, a coat on the hook by the door that had been there long enough that no one had moved it. The kitchen had the specific stillness of a kitchen that had not been used. The bay window was still there. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard. The garden was wild. The beds she had kept were overgrown past recognition. The lawn was long enough that the shape of it had changed. And at the back of the yard, enormous in the full summer light, The oak tree Harold had planted the year they bought the house stood with the specific permanence of something that had been growing quietly and without anyone's permission or assistance for 40 years and had arrived at a size that no one who planted it could have predicted. "There it is," Eleanor said. "There it is," Marcus said from behind her. She turned from the window and looked at the kitchen, at the specific dimensions of the space, the counter where she had stood every morning, the table where she had sat with the window at her back. She pulled out a chair and sat down at the table and put her hands flat on it. He sat down across from her. They were not in a conference room. They were not at a facility table with a legal pad between them and a window that looked out at bare trees. They were in a kitchen in June with the backyard outside the window and 40 years of a family's life accumulated in the rooms around them. And they were a 32-year-old man who had answered a phone call in March and a 78-year-old woman who had been waiting in a room for 2 years and who had never once stopped being entirely herself. And they were grandmother and grandson, which was a thing neither of them had had the chance to practice and which they were going to have to learn in the available time. Marcus said, "I'm going to need to come by on weekends for a while to help with the garden." Eleanor looked at him. "You don't know anything about gardens." "No," he said, "but I learned things." Something crossed her face that was, for the first time in all the Thursdays and all the conference rooms and all the careful measured conversations, simply a smile. Not the cautious opening of a door, not the loosening of something held tight. A smile. The specific expression of a woman who has been waiting to be surprised by something good for a very long time and has finally been surprised. "Your mother used to say that," Eleanor said. "When she was young, she would try something she didn't know how to do, and when I asked if she was sure, she'd say, 'I learned things.'" In exactly that tone. She looked at him. Exactly that tone. Marcus looked at his hands on the table. He looked at the window and the oak tree beyond it. He said, "Tell me about her. When she was young. Tell me the things she would have told me herself if she'd had more time." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She looked at him with the gray eyes that had assessed him in a conference room in March and had been learning him ever since, the specifics of him, the way he held a pen, the way he went still when he was thinking, the way he picked up the phone. She said, she was fearless in the way of people who don't have very much to lose and decide to treat that as a kind of freedom rather than a disadvantage. She paused. She was funny. I don't know if you knew how funny she was. She had a very dry way of saying things. She could make me laugh when I didn't want to. She paused again. She was kind in the specific way that cost you something. She knew what she was giving up when she gave it, and she gave it anyway, and she never asked for it back. Marcus listened. He did not take notes. This was not a room that needed notes. Eleanor talked for a long time, longer than he had expected, about Patricia at 15 and Patricia at 20 and Patricia the year she left, and about the small careful things Eleanor had kept from that time: a letter, a photograph, a memory of a Sunday afternoon in the garden when Patricia was 12 and had helped Eleanor plant the first row of the flower beds that were now overgrown outside the window. She talked about the things she regretted, and she talked about them plainly and without dressing them up as something more complicated than what they were, because she was a woman who had spent 2 years in a room with nothing to do but think, and the thinking had burned away the comfortable versions of things and left only the true ones. Marcus listened, and the morning moved around them the way mornings move when you are sitting still in the middle of them. At some point, Eleanor got up and made coffee. The kitchen had a percolator, old, that had been in the house for 20 years, and it worked, and the coffee it made was strong and slightly bitter in the way of coffee made by a machine that has not been used in 2 years and is remembering how. She set a cup in front of him and sat down again, and they drank their coffee with the backyard outside the window and the oak tree standing in it, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then Eleanor reached into the pocket of her cardigan and set something on the table between them. A small photograph, worn at the edges. A boy of about 12 in front of a school building, backpack on, looking at the camera with Patricia's eyes and the slightly sideways expression of a person who was not entirely sure the camera deserved his full attention. He looked at it for a long time. "I've had that since you were 12 years old," Eleanor said. "It came in a letter your mother sent." She paused. "I've been carrying it for 20 years in a book. I want you to have it." Marcus looked at the photograph. He thought about a photograph of his own that sat on the nightstand of his apartment. Patricia in her 20s, standing in front of the apartment on Garfield Street, laughing at something outside the frame with the unguarded laugh of a person who is not thinking about being photographed and whose whole face is in it. He had found it in a box after she died. "Keep it," he said. "Keep it here, in the book. And I'll come back on Saturday to start on the garden, and it'll still be here." Eleanor looked at him. She looked at him with the specific understanding of a woman who recognizes that the person across from her is saying we have time now. Not as a promise of anything beyond the fact of it, but as the fact itself. We have time now. It's here. We're in it. She put the photograph back in her pocket. She picked up her coffee. "Saturday," she said. "Bring work clothes. The back bed is going to take most of the morning." Marcus said, "I'll be here at 8. Outside the kitchen window, the oak tree stood in the June morning, enormous and still in the way of things that have been growing for a long time and have arrived at the size they intended to reach. The flower beds along the back were overgrown. Yes, and the lawn was long, and the garden was wild in the way of something that had been left to itself and had spent the time becoming something untended and honest. It would take work. It would take Saturdays and patience and learning things you did not already know. It would take time. They had time. A young attorney answered a phone call on a Wednesday morning in March and drove 45 minutes to a care facility on a Thursday because a nurse had filed a concern that hadn't gone anywhere through the standard channels. He did not know, when he answered the call, that the woman in room 118 was his grandmother. He did not know, when he walked into the conference room, that he was about to sit across a table from the person his mother had carried quietly in her chest for 50 years. He went because a woman was in a room she shouldn't have been in, and no one had come, and he was there, and he had the capacity to do something about it. That was all it took. That was exactly all it took. Gerald Harmon had spent 2 years and $300,000 turning a family into a transaction, and the thing that undid it was an attorney who picked up a phone call that wasn't his to take and drove 45 minutes on a gray Thursday morning and sat down across from a stranger and said, "I'm going to listen now. I'm not summarizing until I'm sure I have it right." Patricia Webb had spent 30 years doing the same thing in other people's homes, sitting across from the forgotten ones, the managed ones, the ones whose days had been arranged by someone else without being asked, and she had never done it for a reward, and she had never done it expecting one, and she had done it because it was in front of her, and she had the capacity to do it. She had also raised someone who did the same thing. That was her legacy. Not money, not property, not anything that could be transferred through a document or managed by an advisory firm registered in Delaware. A way of being in a room with people who needed someone to be in the room with them. A specific kind of attention that does not require a reason beyond the fact that the person is there and the attention is yours to give. Eleanor Harmon sat at her kitchen table in June with the bay window behind her and the oak tree outside it and the whole of the house still around her. And she drank her coffee, and she looked at the grandson she had been given back at 32 years old through a chain of events that had started with a nurse who could not stop looking and an attorney who could not stop listening. And she thought, this is what one act can do. One phone call answered, one car pointed in the right direction, one person in one room who decided to stay. She had spent 11 years in a room by herself and believed, for most of those years, that the door was closed for good. And then the door opened because someone was on the other side of it who had not been trying to find her and had found her anyway, and who had been raised by a woman Eleanor had failed to hold on to, and who had arrived on a gray Thursday morning with a legal pad and an uncapped pen and the specific quality of a person who pays attention and does not look away. She had been given back more than a house. She had been given back the thread she had dropped 30 years ago, and it turned out the thread had not broken. It had just been waiting in another hand. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.